Try a few other methods first.
Well, it's up to you, of course. If you can get along without it, so much the better. But with Class 2, I don't think you've got very much chance.
Most school films are on the side of tradition. This completely reverses that from the word go. Newfangled is good and old traditional is bad, because actually it's got sour and cynical, doesn't believe in themselves, no self-esteem, and doesn't believe in the children either. There's a boy in class, played by Richard O'Sullivan, called Harkness, who begins to understand and identify with the Max Bygraves character. But there's a riot in the classroom, and the perpetrators of the riot say, why isn't Harkness getting beaten as well?
What about Harkness, then?
Yeah, what about Harkness? He was shouting too.
Yeah, what about Harkness?
He was making more noise than anybody.
Bet you don't cane him.
Teacher's pet, blue eyes.
Yeah, it's always...
Be quiet! All right, come on, you two, Harkness.
Actually, Harkness was trying to stop the others from rioting, but Bygraves doesn't know that, so he whacks him as well as the others.
Sit down.
So you haven't just got resorting to the cane, you've got injustice as well. And all the gains that have been made in the first half of the film of getting this boy's confidence are completely shattered in that moment. And the injustice of it, the resorting to the cane, the fact that Bygraves didn't believe him, all those things come through and it's snapped. There's no trust between teacher and student anymore. It's a very important moment.
Why did you join in with them? Against me?
I didn't know I was trying to shut him up.
Should have known that, shouldn't I?
You should, shouldn't you?
The film's moral is clear. The use of the cane is destructive, embittering. It creates rebellion. It was a view that would be represented even more vividly in the 1968 film, If.
You three have become a danger to the morale of the whole house.
By the time of If, it's a State of the Nation movie almost. It's not just about the school, it's about the establishment, it's about rebellion, it's about how the establishment sustains itself through violence.
You should be prepared to set an example of responsibility.
You're a nuisance.
And as such, you must be punished.
And my goodness, they really go for it. It is a terrifying scene. In fact, at the time, I remember reviewers actually compared it with the Gestapo, that scene. You know, it's like a scene in a concentration camp movie. Not just because of the thrashing, but because you've got the horizontal bars in the gym. You've got the boys going in, and when Travis goes in, Malcolm McDowell, he puts out his hands on the horizontal. It's clearly a crucifixion that's going on. I mean, that's, you know, very clear. So it's much more than just a flogging.
Wait till you're told. Sit down.
This is a ritual humiliation, and it's going to sow the seeds of revolt. So you get the beating, and then dissolve. Resistance is the next chapter heading. That is the last straw.
In the 60s, they did talk about collapse into disorder if it disappeared, but then there were films like Lindsay Anderson's If that indicated the opposite, that it actually caused a collapse into disorder.
If's final scene was always meant to be a fantasy. Travis, the revolutionary, fighting the massed forces of the establishment with their obsession with tradition and discipline. But the potential for corporal punishment to lead to rebellion was beginning to be played out in reality. In 1972, school children took to the streets.
Trafalgar Square, May the 17th. The forces of law and order are on standby for trouble, ready to turn away a march of London school children organised by the Schools Action Union. Among those demonstrating are many who say they're angry at being treated by teachers as though they were less than human. Some young people here see the movement as a way of bringing the class struggle into the classroom.
The school strikes were initially they were very much issue-based. and had some very specific aims which were very relevant to all children in schools, really.
It's just not the uniform, it's the caning that matters.
Corporal punishment was very significant to the campaign. In public schools there was always the history of children should get 6 of the best, but I'm actually not sure it happened as much there as it did in a lot of the state schools, particularly in secondary moderns. Children from all over London just kept on arriving, and there were hundreds upon hundreds of children. So what they did was they split us into groups, and they kept herding us all over the place. And the main idea seemed to be to stop us getting into Trafalgar Square.
The demonstration should have taken place here in Trafalgar Square at 11 o'clock, but it didn't, because the police cordoned off the square and refused to allow any of the children in. A crowd gathered on the steps at the far side of the square decided to go to Hyde Park.
The demonstration attracted plenty of media interest. From her parents' house in London, Liza Dresner acted as a representative for the school's Action Union.
I can remember a very funny moment when I was asked how many members the Youth Schools Action Union had.
How many members do you have?
We never give out membership figures. It's policy that we don't give out membership
figures. Why not?
We just never have done and we never will do. It's part of our tactics.
And I cobbled together some kind of answer, and the fact was we had no idea.
Now, if people are never aware how many of us there are, they never know if they've smashed us or not.
But isn't it true that there are grown-ups, not school children, in the organisation who are influencing it all, giving their advice?
No, certainly not. I mean, obviously we accept advice from everybody. People who respect us, we respect.
All of us got deeply frustrated by the fact that everybody seemed to be looking for these hidden adults, because it just carried on this myth that children cannot think.
There's nobody pulling strings. There's no sort of person paying us. I wish somebody was. We haven't got any money. But there's no one individual who's paying us and saying, you do our views and we'll give you so much money. We're just working with school students and teachers fighting for revolutionary change.
We were thinking for ourselves. We were making our own decisions. I'm very proud of the way we reacted during that time. I think what the SAU did and what the strikes did was bring corporal punishment as an issue to the forefront of discussion. I think it was extraordinary. I think a lot of the children who came out were extraordinary. They took amazing risks.
Just a year later, inner London schools did abolish the cane, but only in primary schools. In the judicial system, by contrast, corporal punishment had been banned since 1948. In the reforming mood of the 1960s, young offenders who might once have been burged were now described as victims of society. All this created a backlash.
Let Mr. Butler get his head out of the fluffy clouds of idealism. And I say this very seriously. Let him be a man and let him reintroduce corporal punishment for these young offenders.
This is the instrument of punishment and deterrence that people here on Clydeside, many of them, want to see brought back.
Pressing the button.
With growing fears about violent crime and delinquency, calls for a return to the short, sharp shock were frequent. In Glasgow, a society was formed to bring back the birch.
The members of the society, working actively in the campaign, defended their attitude vigorously.
Let me quote to you what one of those boys said. He said, 9 times I felt this thing coming down on me and I just screamed and screamed and screamed.
And what a cad he must have been. Because think what he must have done to merit that. Think of it. And think of some of the people, like the policeman, who was blinded in the course of his duty. That's a life sentence that he's got. There's another person I spoke to who's ended in a mental home for life.
When we hear of an atrocious crime, I mean, we hear of an elderly lady taking her pension from the local post office, knocked to the ground and kicked about the head, a little bit of money stolen. I think we all have a visceral reaction. Why doesn't somebody punch this person? Why doesn't this person be subjected to some of the indignities that they have imposed on this innocent person? I think that is almost a human instinct.
Why do you want to see the birch brought back?
Well, I would say my reasons are because at the moment I feel the penalties being imposed for crimes of vicious assault are not really bringing these assaults to an end. They're not having the desired effect.
It's against this background of increasing crimes of violence that the movement is growing for the reintroduction of the birch. It gathered momentum last July after an incident in the Isle of Man when 4 Glasgow youths of 19 were convicted of assaulting 2 sunbathers, and it was a serious assault. One of the sunbathers had his jaw broken and had to have 5 stitches put in his head. The youths from Glasgow were fined a total of £80, but that was not all. They were taken downstairs and each given 9 strokes of the birch. This led to enormous publicity here in Scotland and many letters to the newspapers welcoming this use of the birch.
I think in a case like that, the birch would be a more effective deterrent than probation.
Birching may have gone from UK courts, but in the Isle of Man, its use for young offenders increased in the 60s. Many on the mainland looked on with envy.
The Isle of Man is the last place in Europe which allows corporal punishment by the state. The last place where a policeman can cane a child of 8 or birch a boy of 14.
And the reason that birching was retained in the Isle of Man was the Isle of Man wanted to maintain its distinctive image of itself. Small towns, small communities, offenders come from the outside. It was a very big holiday resort until quite modern times. Such disorder as there was came from those ruffians in Liverpool and Merseyside who descended on the island and misbehaved.
The majority of Manxmen support the laws on corporal punishment because they fear that the tourists who treble the population during attractions like the TT races bring hooliganism with them. They see Britain, which they call the adjacent island, as a thug-ridden country where no one is safe to walk the streets at night. They think the birch helps to preserve the Isle of Man as a safe and civilized haven, and the birching issue is just part of their bid to run the island the way they want, without any interference from Britain.
I think people do see it as a feature. I think when I've been across on many occasions, one of the first things people greet me with, "Oh, you live in the Isle of Man. You've got the birch. You're one of the few civilized places that are left."
But by the late 1970s, the tide was turning against the Isle of Man, at least in Europe.